Hey, this is Mark, and you're welcome to AUTOSAYS. Just 15 years ago, China was importing electric vehicle technology from the West, struggling to even copy a decent combustion engine. Today, they're shipping EVs to Europe by the thousands, undercutting Tesla on price, and somehow making money doing it. How does a country go from industrial copycat to electric vehicle superpower in less than 2 decades? The answer isn't what you think, and it's going to change everything you know about the global car industry. If you want to understand where your next car is really coming from and why Detroit is sweating bullets right now, smash that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal will blow your mind. Now, let me take you back to a moment in history that nobody saw coming. It's 2009, and the world economy is on life support. General Motors has just declared bankruptcy, the American auto industry is begging Congress for bailout money, and in a conference room in Beijing, a group of Chinese officials is making a decision that will reshape the entire automotive landscape. They're looking at a problem. China's cities are choking on smog, their oil imports are making them vulnerable to Middle Eastern instability, and their car manufacturers are decades behind Toyota, Ford, and Volkswagen in traditional engine technology. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of trying to catch up in a race they've already lost, they decide to change the game entirely. They're going to leapfrog combustion engines and bet everything on electric. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds risky, right? But here's the financial logic that nobody outside China understood at the time. The Chinese government looked at the cost structure of traditional automaking and realized something brilliant. Building a world-class combustion engine requires 50 years of engineering expertise, supply chains that took decades to develop, and brand trust that takes generations to earn. But an electric vehicle? The playing field was level. The technology was new enough that nobody had an insurmountable advantage. The battery was the heart of the car, not some complex engine with 10,000 moving parts. And here's the kicker. China already controlled the global supply chain for rare earth minerals needed for those batteries. They had the lithium, the cobalt, the rare earths. They weren't just betting on EVs, they were betting on a game where they'd already stacked the deck in their favor. So what did they do next? They opened the money spigot like the world had never seen. We're not talking about a few billion in subsidies. Between 2009 and 2023, the Chinese government pumped an estimated $60 billion directly into EV development, manufacturing, and consumer incentives. But wait, it gets even more insane. They created entire cities designed around EV manufacturing. Shenzhen, a city of 12 million people, converted its entire bus fleet to electric, creating instant demand and a testing ground for the technology. They offered consumers up to $10,000 per vehicle in subsidies. They gave EV makers free land, tax breaks for 10 years, and low-interest government loans that didn't need to be paid back if the company hit production targets. Essentially, they removed all financial risk from the equation. But here's what makes this strategy absolutely genius from a financial perspective, and this is where most Western analysts completely missed the plot. The Chinese government wasn't just trying to create a successful car industry, they were building a vertically integrated ecosystem that would make them indispensable to the global transition to electric vehicles. Think about it like this. Imagine if one country controlled all the oil in the world back in 1920. That's essentially what China did with EV supply chains. They invested in lithium mines in Australia and South America, they bought up cobalt operations in Africa, they built gigantic battery factories that could produce cells cheaper than anyone else on Earth. By 2015, China controlled 80% of the world's raw rare earth mineral processing. They weren't just making cars, they were controlling the raw materials, the processing, the battery production, the motors, and the final assembly. Every other country that wanted to go electric would have to buy something from China. Now here's where the story takes a turn that should terrify traditional automakers. Around 2014, a former engineer named Xpeng left his comfortable job at a tech company and started an EV manufacturer called Xpeng. A salesman named Li Bin founded NIO, a battery maker named Wang Xuanfu had already started BYD years earlier. These weren't traditional car guys, they were tech entrepreneurs who understood software, user experience, and rapid iteration. And they had something American and European car makers didn't. They had a government that treated them like national champions in a strategic war. BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams, started as a battery company. Wang Xuanfu studied the entire automotive supply chain and realized something that Detroit had forgotten. Cars had become too complicated. A traditional luxury car had over 30,000 parts, but an EV, you could build one with fewer than 2,000 components. Less complexity meant lower costs, faster production, and fewer things to break. So BYD started making simple, affordable EVs that were good enough. Not perfect, not luxury, just good enough for the average Chinese consumer. And here's the financial masterstroke. While Tesla was trying to make EVs cool and expensive, BYD was making them cheap and practical. They figured out how to build an EV that costs $12,000 and still turned a profit. How? Vertical integration on steroids. They made their own batteries, their own chips, their own motors, even their own seats. They cut out every middleman and passed some savings to consumers while banking the rest. By 2023, BYD was selling more EVs than Tesla. Let that sink in for a second. A company most Americans had never heard of was outselling the most famous EV maker on the planet. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, but what about quality? Don't Chinese EVs fall apart? Here's where the history lesson gets really interesting. Remember when Japanese cars entered the American market in the 1970s? Everyone laughed at them, cheap, tinny little things that couldn't compete with American muscle. Then the oil crisis hit, and suddenly fuel efficiency mattered more than horsepower. By the 1980s, Toyota and Honda were eating Detroit's lunch. The exact same pattern is playing out right now with Chinese EVs. Early models were rough, sure, but the pace of improvement has been breathtaking. NIO is making luxury SUVs with battery swap technology that puts Tesla's charging network to shame. You pull into a station and a robot swaps your dead battery for a full one in 3 minutes. 3 minutes! Xpeng has self-driving technology that rivals anything from Silicon Valley. Zeekr, owned by Geely, is making premium EVs that European journalists are calling legitimate Mercedes competitors, and they're doing it for half the price. Here's the really scary part for Western automakers. The cost advantage isn't going away. A recent study found that Chinese EV makers have a 30% structural cost advantage over Western competitors. That's not because of cheap labor anymore. It's because of scale, vertical integration, and a supply chain that's been optimized for 15 years. When you can make your own batteries for $60 per kilowatt hour and your competitor is paying $90, you're going to win on price every single time. And price matters. It matters a lot. So now we're in Act 3, and this is where it gets really wild. Chinese EV makers are looking at their saturated domestic market and realizing they need to expand. Europe is the first target. In 2023, Chinese EVs captured 8% of the European market, up from almost zero just 3 years earlier. They're arriving on ships by the thousands, priced 20 to 30% below European comparable models. The European Union is freaking out. They've launched anti-subsidy investigations and are threatening tariffs because they see what's coming. Their domestic car industry, which employs millions of people, is facing an existential threat. But here's the plot twist. Even with tariffs, Chinese EVs might still be cheaper. And some Chinese companies are getting smart. They're building factories in Europe to avoid tariffs entirely. BYD is constructing a massive plant in Hungary. Chery is partnering with Spanish companies. They're not just exporting, they're embedding themselves in the European industrial base. Now, you're probably wondering, what about America? Here's where things get complicated. The US has essentially built a wall around its EV market. The Inflation Reduction Act gives $7,500 in tax credits, but only if the vehicle is assembled in North America with batteries made from North American or allied nation materials. It's specifically designed to keep Chinese EVs out, and it's working for now. You can't buy a BYD or NIO in America. But here's what keeps industry analysts up at night. How long can that last? American consumers are getting hammered by inflation. The average new car price in the US is over $47,000. If Chinese companies offered a decent EV for $25,000, how long before political pressure forces a rethinking of those restrictions? And what if Chinese companies do what Japanese and Korean companies did and just build factories in America? Suddenly, you've got American workers building Chinese-designed cars, and the political calculus gets a lot more complicated.
Here's the financial reality that nobody wants to admit. The traditional auto industry's business model is dying. They make most of their profit on parts and service over a vehicle's lifetime, but EVs have fewer parts and need less service. The entire dealer network model doesn't work when cars don't need oil changes and brake pads last 3 times longer. Chinese EV makers don't have this legacy problem. They're designing direct-to-consumer sales models from scratch. They're thinking of cars as software platforms that generate revenue through subscriptions and over-the-air updates. They're building the business model of the future, while Western car makers are trying to protect the business model of the past. So here's where we land. China's EV explosion wasn't an accident or just cheap labor. It was a calculated, decade-long financial and industrial strategy that leveraged government resources, controlled supply chains, and tech industry thinking to create a legitimate competitive advantage.
They identified a moment in history where the rules were being rewritten and made sure they'd be writing them. The question now isn't whether Chinese EVs are coming. They're already here. The question is whether Western companies can adapt fast enough, whether governments will protect their industries with tariffs and restrictions, and whether consumers will ultimately care more about price and features than the badge on the front. One thing's certain, the automotive world of 2035 is going to look radically different from today, and the decisions being made right now in boardrooms in Detroit, Stuttgart, and Shanghai are going to determine who survives and who becomes the next Studebaker. If this story opened your eyes to what's really happening in the global car industry, hit that like button, subscribe to AUTOSAYS, and drop a comment telling me which Chinese EV brand you think will make it big in America first. Trust me, you're going to want to follow this story because it's just getting started, and the next chapter is going to be absolutely wild.